The mining town of Devil's Gulch clung to the mountainside like a scar that refused to heal, its torch-lit streets and shuttered windows hiding a ruthless gang's iron grip on its people. Behind the weathered walls of the town's establishments, whispers spread of the notorious Wolf Pack Brotherhood, whose reign of terror had turned this once prosperous settlement into a den of fear and submission. But none of them could have predicted how their world would change when a soft-spoken stranger in a weather-worn coat stepped off the evening stage, his gentle eyes masking a past written in gunsmoke and legend. Welcome back, everyone. If this story resonates with you, make sure to let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will leave you absolutely speechless. The evening winds howled through Devil's Gulch's steep streets as Jackson Cole, leader of the Wolf Pack Brotherhood, held court in the Iron Horse Saloon. His men's raucous laughter echoed off the walls as they terrorized Mary Sullivan, the young owner who had dared to refuse their protection payment. The sound of breaking bottles and splintering wood carried out into the mud-slicked street, where a lone figure had just finished tying his dun-colored horse to the hitching post. The stranger moved with an easy grace that seemed almost out of place in the rough-hewn mining town. His dark grey coat, though well-maintained, spoke of countless miles on the trail, and the simple black hat pulled low over his eyes gave away nothing of the man beneath it. Only the well-worn walnut grips of his revolvers, peeking out from beneath his coat, hinted at something more than just another drifter seeking shelter from the coming storm. Inside the Iron Horse, Mary Sullivan watched helplessly as Cole's men systematically destroyed the saloon her father had built with his own hands. The wanted posters hanging by the door had been torn down and trampled, though one remained partially visible beneath a broken chair, its illustration showing the distinctive Wolf's Head brand that had become the Brotherhood's calling card across 3 territories. "Mighty fine establishment you got here, Miss Sullivan," Cole drawled, his voice carrying the false pleasantry that always preceded his worst acts of cruelty. The lamplight gleamed off the silver wolf's headpin on his black vest as he casually overturned another table. "Be a real shame if something happened to it, or to that pretty face of yours." The saloon's few regular patrons had long since fled, all except old Tom Wheeler, the elderly bartender who had worked for Mary's father. He stood trembling behind the bar, his lined face a mask of helpless anger as he watched the destruction unfold. The only other sound came from the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down to what everyone feared would be the young owner's last stand. The creak of the saloon's batwing doors drew every eye. The stranger stood, framed in the doorway, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. In the sudden silence, the soft jingle of his spurs seemed unnaturally loud as he made his way to the bar, appearing to take no notice of the tension around him. "Coffee, if you have it," he said quietly to old Tom, placing a coin on the scarred wooden surface. His voice was soft, with an accent that hinted at an education far from frontier territories. Cole's right-hand man, a brute known only as Bear, stepped forward with a sneer. "This here's a private business meeting, friend. Best take yourself elsewhere." His hand rested meaningfully on the gun at his hip, a gesture that had sent braver men running from Devil's Gulch. The stranger took the steaming cup Tom offered, still not turning to acknowledge the threat. "Good coffee's hard to find in these parts," he remarked as if commenting on the weather. "Seems a shame to waste it." He took a slow sip, and those close enough noticed that despite his relaxed demeanor, his free hand remained close to his side, just inches from his holster. Cole studied the newcomer with the calculating eyes of a predator. Something about the stranger's calm made him uneasy, though he couldn't say why. "You're either deaf, dumb, or looking to die," he said, moving to stand beside Bear. "Which is it?" Finally, the stranger turned and Mary Sullivan felt her breath catch. His face was unremarkable, neither handsome nor ugly, neither young nor old, but his eyes were like looking into deep water, calm on the surface but hiding unknowable depths. "Just passing through," the stranger said, "looking for work." Cole's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Work? Well, why didn't you say so?" He gestured. "Around the saloon. We're always looking for men who know how to follow orders. Ain't that right, Miss Sullivan?" Mary's defiant glare was answer enough, but before Cole could respond, the stranger spoke again, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the room. "Seems to me the lady's already got enough help." He set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Though I suspect that's not the kind of work you had in mind." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Cole's false smile vanished. Outside, the storm's intensity grew, rattling the windows like the breath of a waiting beast. None of the Wolf Pack knew it yet, but they were about to learn why some legends are whispered about in fear, and why the name Nathan Hawke still caused hardened marshals to look over their shoulders in territories far to the east. The moment crystallized like frost on a window pane, each breath visible in the suddenly cold saloon air. Cole's men had spread out instinctively, their practiced movements speaking of countless similar situations. But something was different this time. The stranger's calm seemed to infect the very atmosphere, turning their usual intimidation. "Tactics hollow. You've got a peculiar way of talking for a drifter," Cole observed, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his gun belt. "Almost reminds me of stories I heard back east, tales about a man they called the Ghost Marshal." He watched the stranger carefully for any reaction, but the man's face remained impassive as he took another sip of coffee. Bear, less patient than his boss, took another threatening step forward. "Boss, want me to show this fancy-talking fellow the door? Maybe introduce him to the mining creek at the bottom of the Gulch?" His meaty hands flexed eagerly. "You know what interests me?" the stranger said, setting his cup down with deliberate care. "How a man like you, Mr. Cole, ended up so far from St. Louis." Now it was Cole's turn to stiffen slightly, though he covered it well. "Interesting that you'd mention the East. Old." Tom Wheeler's eyes widened at this exchange, his trembling hands stilling on the bar rag he'd been wringing. Mary Sullivan, still standing amid the wreckage of her tables, sensed the subtle shift in power that had just occurred. The stranger knew something that had put the first hint of uncertainty in Jackson Cole's calculating eyes. "Seems to me," the stranger continued, his voice as casual as if discussing the weather, "that the statute of limitations on bank robbery doesn't expire just because a man changes territories, especially when the bank president's son didn't survive the robbery." He finally turned to face Cole fully. "Isn't that right, William James Coleridge?" The reaction was immediate. Two of Cole's men drew their guns, but their leader raised a hand, stopping them. His face had transformed, the false charm replaced by something cold and reptilian. "You've got me at a disadvantage, stranger, though I suspect that won't last long." "Most folks around here call me Hawke," the stranger replied, stretching out. The silence that followed his name. Nathan Hawke. The effect of the name was electric. Bear took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of color. One of the younger gang members actually crossed himself. Even Cole's composed facade cracked slightly, though he recovered quickly. "The Ghost Marshal himself," Cole said softly, his voice taking on a new edge. "I heard you died in that mess. Down in Texas, 5 years ago, wasn't it?" "Stories of my death," Hawke replied with the ghost of a smile, "tend to be greatly exaggerated." His eyes swept the room, seeming to catalogue each man's position without obvious movement. "Just like stories about your brotherhood's strength in these parts." Mary Sullivan watched the exchange with growing amazement. She'd heard whispered legends of the Ghost Marshal during her childhood back east, tales of a lawman who appeared like a spirit of vengeance wherever justice had failed, leaving restored order and trembling witnesses in his wake. But surely, Those were just stories meant to frighten outlaws and comfort honest folk. Cole's next move surprised everyone. He laughed, a genuine, almost delighted sound that echoed off the saloon's walls. "Boys," he announced to his men, "this is what they call a genuine historical moment. The famous Nathan Hawke, the terror of every outlaw from the Mississippi to the Rockies, has wandered into our humble establishment." His hand moved casually to rest on his gun, though I have to wonder why. "Maybe I really was just looking for good coffee," Hawke said, but his easy tone had taken on a warning edge. "Or maybe I've been following a trail of terrorized towns and broken families across 3 territories, leading right to your door." "Or maybe," Cole countered, his smile turning predatory, "you've finally bit off more than you can chew. You see, Marshal, times have changed. The days of lone lawmen dispensing frontier justice are over. This is the age of organization, of empire." He gestured around the saloon. "Devil's Gulch is just one small part of something much bigger. The Wolf Pack Brotherhood runs everything from here to the Canadian border: supply lines, protection rackets, mining claims. We have judges in our pockets and territorial governors on our payroll. And yet," Hawke observed, "you're still shaking down small-town saloon owners." His words carried just enough contempt to make Cole's face darken. "Makes me wonder if the Brotherhood is as powerful as you claim." Before Cole could respond, the saloon's doors burst open again. A breathless young man in a Wolf Pack bandana stumbled in, his eyes wild. "Boss, territorial marshals, 2 days out from Fort Benton, heading this way. Someone must have gotten word to them about the gold shipment." Cole's rage at the interruption melted into a calculating smile. "Well now, isn't that interesting timing?" His eyes locked onto Hawke. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Marshal?" "Like I said," Hawke replied evenly, "just passing through." But something in his stance had changed, becoming more coiled, more ready. Everyone in the room could feel it, the calm before the storm. "Search him," Cole ordered suddenly, "and this time, be thorough." He turned to Mary Sullivan, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "Then we'll finish our business discussion, perhaps with a more cooperative attitude on your part, my dear." The next few seconds would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed them. But all would agree on one thing: they had never seen anyone move so fast. Bear made his first and last mistake when he reached for Hawke's shoulder with his massive hand. What happened next seemed to defy the natural order of things, like watching water flow uphill. Hawke's movement was so smooth, so practiced, that it appeared almost gentle, until Bear found himself face down on the wooden floor, his arm twisted at an angle that made even hardened outlaws wince. "Now, gentlemen," Hawke said in that same quiet voice, though it carried clearly through the stunned silence, "I believe we were discussing coffee." His boot rested lightly on Bear's wrist, preventing any movement while keeping both hands free. The position seemed casual, but every man in the room recognized the deadly efficiency behind it. Cole's hand had moved to his gun, but he hadn't drawn. Not yet. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation. "You know what they never mentioned in those stories about you, Marshal, how you always seem to show up just before something big is about to happen. Almost like you've got a network of informants. Like maybe, say, a certain mining clerk who disappeared from our payroll last week." Through the saloon's windows, torchlight illuminated the falling snow, casting shifting shadows across the tense scene. Old Tom had backed away from the bar, while Mary Sullivan stood frozen, her hand gripping a broken chair back. The grandfather. Clock's steady ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence. "The thing about networks," Hawke replied, applying slightly more pressure to Bear's wrist when the big man tried to move, "is that they work both ways. So I know about the gold shipment you're planning to hijack. I know about the 3 mining families who disappeared when they refused to sell their claims. And I know about the territorial judge's son you're holding at the mining camp to ensure his father's cooperation." Cole's smile had become a grimace. "Then you also know you're outnumbered. I've got 30 men in town and another 50 at the camp. Even the ghost marshal can't fight those odds." "Who said anything about fighting?" Hawk's reply carried a note of almost genuine puzzlement. "I'm just enjoying my coffee and this stimulating conversation." He finally released Bear, stepping back to lean casually against the bar. The big man scrambled to his feet, face red with rage and humiliation. "Kill him!" Bear roared, drawing his gun. But before he could level it, Hawk's hand moved in a blur. The coffee cup sailed through the air, striking Bear's weapon with stunning precision. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Bear dropped it, cursing in pain. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for Mary Sullivan. 2 more of Cole's men went for their guns, but Hawk was already moving. His first shot, came from the hip, impossibly fast, sending one man's weapon spinning away in a spray of splinters. His second shot threaded the needle between 2 gang members, shattering the mirror behind them and causing both to dive for cover. "That's enough." Cole's voice cracked like a whip. He hadn't drawn his weapon, but his hand remained hovering near it. "Very impressive, Marshal. But if you were planning to arrest me, you'd have done it already. So why don't we stop dancing around and you tell me what you really want?" Hawk holstered his smoking gun with fluid grace, just delivering a message. "The territorial marshals aren't coming alone. They've got signed confessions from your former mining clerk, detailing every crooked claim, every payoff, every murder. The Wolf Pack Brotherhood's time in Montana is coming to an end. Is that so?" Cole's laugh held no humor now. "Well, let me share something with you, Marshal. In about 10 minutes, my men are going to come through that door having completed a very specific task. You see, I had them follow your back trail as soon as you rode into town. He found some interesting things at the way station you passed through, including a very interesting conversation with the station master about a certain U.S. Marshal's badge you left in his safekeeping." Something flickered in Hawk's eyes, the first real emotion he'd shown since entering the saloon. Cole pressed his advantage. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out that door, get on your horse, and ride away. In exchange, I won't have my men burn down the way station with the station master and his family inside." The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind outside and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Mary Sullivan watched as something dark passed behind Hawk's calm facade, like a storm cloud shadowing the sun. She had seen men faced with impossible choices before. Her father had faced one the night the Wolf Pack first came to Devil's Gulch. But she had never seen someone seem to age years in mere seconds, only to emerge somehow stronger. "You know, the problem with men like you, Cole," Hawk's voice had changed, becoming somehow both softer and more dangerous. "You always think you're the smartest man in the room. Always think you've considered every angle." He straightened up from the bar, his movements deliberately slow. "Did you ever stop to wonder why a U.S. Marshal would leave his badge at a way station?" Cole's triumphant expression faltered slightly. In that moment of uncertainty, Hawk's next words fell like hammer blows. "Or why I'd want you to send men to follow my trail, or why I'd let you think you had the upper hand." The young messenger who had brought news of the marshals suddenly went pale. "Boss, the men we sent, they haven't reported back. They should have been here by now." The grandfather clock struck the hour, its chimes echoing through the now silent saloon. As if on cue, a distant explosion rattled the windows, followed by another and another. In the street outside, shouts of alarm began to rise from different parts of town. "Interesting timing," Hawk remarked mildly, picking up the coffee pot and refilling his cup. "You might want to send someone to check on your ammunition storage and your stables and possibly that fancy headquarters of yours up on the hill." He took a slow sip. though I suspect they're all having similar problems right about now." Cole's face transformed from shock to fury as more explosions echoed through the snowy night. He finally drew his gun, the movement snake-quick, but Hawk hadn't moved from his position at the bar. The gang leader's hand was rock-steady as he aimed at Hawk's chest, but his eyes betrayed a growing unease. "You're bluffing!" Cole snarled, though the continuing sounds of chaos from outside suggested otherwise. "This is some kind of trick." Through the windows they could see men running through the snow-filled streets, orange flames reflecting off the heavy flakes. "You know what your real mistake was?" Hawk took another sip of coffee, seeming unconcerned by the gun aimed at his heart. "Not wondering why I chose tonight, or why I let your man ride out to warn you about those marshals?" He set his cup down, with deliberate care. "Tell me, how many of your men did you send to follow my trail? 10, 15? A new voice answered from the saloon's back door. 17, to be exact. Thomas Green, the mining clerk Cole had mentioned earlier, stepped into view, a rifle held confidently in his hands. "All of them currently tied up at the way station, along with some very interesting documentation they were kind enough to bring with them." Cole's men shifted nervously, caught between their boss's gun and this new threat. Bear had retrieved his dropped weapon, but he seemed unsure where to point it. Another explosion rocked the night, this one closer, and through the windows they could see flames rising from the direction of the Wolf Pack's main storehouse. "You see, Mr. Cole," Hawk continued, his voice taking on an almost educational tone, "while you were watching me, you forgot to watch your own men, forgot to wonder why some of them had been acting strangely these past few weeks. Like young Billy there." He nodded toward one of the younger gang members, who suddenly stepped away from his companions, drawing his gun to stand beside Green. "Sorry, boss," Billy said, his young face set with determination. "But after what you did to my sister's family over that mining claim, this was a long time coming." Cole's composure cracked further as he began to understand the true scope of what was happening. "How many?" he demanded, his gun hand finally showing a slight tremor. "How many of my own men?" "Enough," Hawk replied simply. "Enough to ensure that right now, while you're standing here threatening me, other things are happening all across Devil's Gulch. The judge's son is being freed from your mining camp. Your hostages are being released. Your documentation is being gathered, and most importantly," he smiled for the first time, though it didn't reach his eyes, "your control is crumbling." As if to emphasize his point, gunfire erupted somewhere in the town, followed by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Mary Sullivan moved closer to old Tom, who had produced a shotgun from behind the bar, his trembling hands now steady on. "The weapon! You still don't understand what you're dealing with," Cole said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "The Brotherhood is bigger than Devil's Gulch. We have connections all the way to—" "Helena!" Hawk cut him off. "Butte, Virginia City? Funny you should mention that. Those territorial marshals you're so worried about, they're not coming here. They're already in those cities right now, acting on information provided by certain members of your organization who decided they preferred amnesty to prison." The grandfather clock ticked steadily as Cole processed this information. Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Bear and the remaining loyal gang members had unconsciously drawn closer to their leader, forming a tight cluster as more shouts echoed from the street. "It's what I do, you see," Hawk continued, his quiet voice carrying clearly despite the growing noise outside. "I find the cracks in organizations like yours, the men who joined out of desperation but can't stomach the cruelty. The ones who've seen too much and want a way out, the young ones like Billy who still have a conscience. I give them a chance to choose a different path." Mary Sullivan watched in amazement as more of Cole's men began to step away from their leader, moving to stand with Green and Billy. The Wolf Pack Brotherhood was fracturing before her eyes, years of fear and intimidation unraveling in minutes. 3 months, Hawk said, answering Cole's unspoken question. 3 months of quiet work, gathering evidence, turning your men, positioning pieces. Tonight was just the end game. He finally stood straight, his hand near, but not on his gun. So now you have a choice, Mr. Cole. You can try to shoot me, in which case a lot of people will die, including most of your loyal men here. Or what? Cole spat, his gun still trained on Hawk's chest. Or you can surrender. Face trial for your crimes in St. Louis. Let your men keep the amnesty deals they've made. End this without more bloodshed. Hawk's voice remained calm, reasonable. It's more than you deserve. But it's not about you. It's about all the people you've hurt, all the lives you've destroyed. They deserve to see justice done properly. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Through the windows, they could see more fires breaking out across town as hidden caches of weapons and documents were destroyed. The sound of hooves announced the arrival of more riders, not marshals, but townspeople who had been waiting for this moment, armed with rifles and years of pent-up courage. Cole looked around the saloon, seeing his once mighty brotherhood crumbling before his eyes. His face twisted into something ugly as he realized the full extent of his defeat. "You really think," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that I'm going to let you destroy everything I've built? That I'll let some ghost story of Belorman take away my empire?" His finger tightened on the trigger, and Mary Sullivan had to stifle a scream. But Hawk hadn't moved, hadn't even tensed. He just stood there, watching Cole with those calm, deep eyes. "No, Mr. Cole," he said softly. "I don't think you're going to let me do anything. I think you're going to make a choice, and that choice is going to tell everyone in this room, including yourself, who you really are." Cole's laugh started low, then built into something that made even his remaining loyal men shift uncomfortably. "Who I really am," he repeated, his gun hand rock steady once again. "Let me show you exactly who I am." He gave a sharp whistle, and suddenly the saloon's front doors burst open. 2 more Wolf Pack members entered, dragging between them Sarah Wheeler, Old Tom's 16-year-old granddaughter. The girl's face was tear-streaked but defiant, and a fresh bruise darkened her cheek. Old Tom's shotgun wavered, then steadied again as Cole's men pushed Sarah to her knees. "Found her trying to warn people at the south end of town," one of the men reported. "Just like you said she might, boss." Something flickered in Hawk's eyes, the first real concern he'd shown all night. Cole saw it, and his smile grew wider. "You see, Marshal, while you were playing your clever game of turning my men and setting your traps, I was playing one of my own. I've known for weeks that something was wrong. Didn't know exactly what, but..." He shrugged. "When you've built something like the Brotherhood, you develop instincts." "Let her go, Cole." Hawk's voice had taken on a new edge. "She's not part of this." "Oh, but she is. Everyone in this miserable town is part of this." Cole moved to stand, behind Sarah, pressing his gun to her temple while keeping his eyes locked on Hawk. "You want to talk about who I really am? I'm the man who understands that power isn't about having the most men or the biggest guns. It's about being willing to do what the other man won't." Mary Sullivan had begun inching toward the bar where Old Tom stood frozen, his shotgun now lowered, face ashen as he watched his granddaughter. Through the windows they could see the fires spreading across town, but the sounds of fighting had died down, replaced by an ominous quiet. "You've got it all planned out, don't you, Marshal?" Cole continued. "The evidence, the turned men, the carefully orchestrated chaos. But that's your weakness. You want everything to be clean, justified, lawful. So here's my counteroffer." His finger tightened slightly on the trigger, making Sarah whimper despite her brave face. "You're going to walk out that door. Your turned men are going to surrender their weapons. And tomorrow, things in Devil's Gulch will go back to exactly how they were." "Or?" Hawk asked quietly, though he clearly knew the answer. "Or I paint that wall with Old Tom's last piece of family." Cole's voice was almost cheerful now. "And then maybe we find out how many other folks in this town need to die before you understand that your kind of justice has no place here." The grandfather clock ticked away the heavy seconds as Hawk stood perfectly still, his eyes moving from Cole to Sarah to old Tom and back again. Mary Sullivan found herself holding her breath, seeing the impossible choice being weighed in the lawman's calm gaze. "You're right about one thing," Hawk finally said, his voice so soft everyone had to strain to hear it. "I do prefer things to be clean, lawful." His hands moved slowly away from his sides, emphasizing that he wasn't reaching for his guns. "But you made a mistake, Mr. Cole. You assumed that because I prefer justice to vengeance, I'm not capable of both." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. As Hawk spoke, Sarah Wheeler's hand had been inching toward her boot, where a small knife, given to her weeks ago by a quiet stranger who'd warned her this day might come, was hidden. Cole, focused entirely on Hawk, didn't notice the movement until it was too late. The girl drove the blade backward and up, catching Cole in the thigh. His gun went off, but his aim was thrown wide, the bullet splintering the bar beside old Tom. In the same instant, Hawk's right hand moved with devastating speed, drawing and firing in one fluid motion that seemed to defy natural law. Cole's gun went spinning from his hand, his wrist bleeding from where Hawk's bullet had creased it. His two men reached for their weapons, but Green and Billy were faster, their guns already drawn and ready. Sarah scrambled away from Cole, running to her grandfather's waiting arms. "That's another thing about justice," Hawk said, his gun unwavering as Cole clutched his bleeding wrist. "Sometimes it comes from unexpected places, from people finding their courage after years of fear, from a young girl brave enough to carry a knife and wait for her moment." Cole looked around wildly, seeing his last hopes of control slipping away. More townspeople were appearing in the doorway, armed with a mixture of rifles, shotguns, and tools from the mining camp. Through the windows, the fires were beginning to die down, and figures could be seen being led away in chains, his own. "Men now in custody. Kill them!" Cole screamed to his remaining loyal followers. "Kill them all! The Brotherhood cannot... The Brotherhood..." The rest of his words were lost as the night exploded into chaos once again. But this time, it was different. This time, the people of Devil's Gulch were ready. This time, they were no longer afraid. And as the final battle for Devil's Gulch began, Nathan Hawk allowed himself a small, grim smile, because sometimes justice wasn't about being the fastest gun or the cleverest strategist. Sometimes it was about giving good people the chance to fight back, and then standing beside them when they did. The next few minutes would write themselves into frontier legend, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The first shots came from everywhere at once, turning the Iron Horse Saloon into a storm of splinters and gunsmoke. Cole's loyal men dove for cover behind overturned tables, while townspeople crowded in the doorway took shelter on either side. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flashes turning night to day in strobing bursts. "Mary, get down!" Hawk's voice cut through the chaos as he pulled the saloon owner behind the relative safety of the thick oak bar. Old Tom was already there, shielding Sarah with his body while keeping his shotgun trained on the nearest Wolf Pack members. The heavy oak of the bar shuddered as bullets struck it, but the aged wood, built to withstand mining town brawls, held firm. "You're dead, Marshal!" Cole's voice rang out from somewhere near the back stairs. "You and this whole worthless town!" Another explosion rocked the night outside, but this one was different, closer, more deliberate. "The mine charges!" Green shouted over the gunfire. "He's got men up there, setting off the explosives we planted." The former mining clerk's face went pale. "If they trigger the main charges near the support beams, the whole mountainside could come down," Hawk finished grimly. He checked his ammunition with practiced efficiency, then turned to Mary. "Your father built this place. Is there another way up to the mine from here?" Mary nodded, her face dirty but determined. The cellars connect to the old drainage tunnels. They run all the way up to the mine, but a bullet splintered the bar near her head, making her duck instinctively. "Billy!" Hawk called to the young turncoat. "Get word to the men outside. Tell them to pull everyone back from the upper streets. If that mountain comes down—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Billy nodded and scrambled toward the door, staying low. "You can't stop it, Marshal." Cole's laugh had taken on a manic edge. "If I can't have Devil's Gulch, no one will. The whole town will be buried, just like those mining families who thought they could stand against the Brotherhood." Through a gap in the bar, they could see him making his way toward the back door, using his own men as shields. Hawk turned to Green. "How many charges did you plant up there?" "Enough to break their control of the mine entrance," the clerk replied. "But if they add more in the wrong places, or the right places from their perspective," Hawk muttered. He made a quick decision. "Mary, show me those tunnels. Green, you and Billy get these people out of here. Old Tom, I'm coming with you," the bartender interrupted, his weathered face set with determination. "I know those tunnels too. Used to smuggle supplies through them during the early days, before the Brotherhood came." Another explosion rocked the building, closer this time. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the very mountains seemed to tremble. Through the windows, they could see people running down the steep streets, away from the ominous rumbling above. "Cole's insane," Mary said as she led them toward the cellar entrance. "He'll kill everyone, including his own men." "That's what men like Cole do when they're cornered," Hawk replied, helping old Tom and Sarah down the steep stairs. "They'd rather destroy everything than admit defeat." His voice carried an edge that suggested personal experience with such men. The cellar was a maze of wine racks and storage crates, lit only by a few scattered lanterns. Mary led them to a heavy iron door set into the rough stone wall. "The tunnel. Entrance is through here. Father used to—" She paused, fighting back tears. "He used to say it was our escape route if things ever got bad enough." "Your father was a smart man," Hawk said softly, "and tonight his foresight might save the whole town." They could still hear gunfire above, but it was growing more sporadic. As both sides realized the greater danger, the iron door groaned open, revealing a dark passage that disappeared into the mountain's heart. The air that rushed out was cool and damp, carrying the scent of mineral-rich earth. "There are branches every few hundred yards," old Tom explained as they moved into the tunnel. "Most lead to dead ends or old mining chambers, but the main line runs straight up to the primary shaft." He handed Sarah a lantern. "Stay close to the walls and watch your step. There are drop-offs that—" His warning was cut off by another explosion, closer and more powerful than the others. The tunnel shook, sending cascades of dirt and small stones raining down on them. In the distance, they could hear the ominous sound of timber supports creaking. "He's going to bring down the whole mountain," Green said, his voice tight with fear. "All those years of mining, the tunnels are like a honeycomb up there. One wrong blast could start a chain reaction." Hawk's face was grim in the lantern light. "That's exactly what he's counting on. His last act of control, proving that he had the power to destroy what he couldn't keep." He checked his guns one more time. "Mary, you know where this tunnel comes out?" She nodded. "There's a maintenance shaft that opens into the main gallery, just below the primary ore processing level." "Good. When we get up there, I need you and Sarah to—" He stopped suddenly, holding up a hand for silence. In the darkness ahead, they could hear voices echoing off the stone walls, accompanied by the sound of boots on rock and the distinctive metallic click of weapons being loaded. "More of Cole's men," old Tom whispered, "probably headed down to set charges in the lower tunnels." Hawk's expression hardened. "Time's up. Green, get everyone else out through one of those side passages you mentioned. Find a safe spot and wait for my signal." "What signal?" Mary asked. The ghost of a smile crossed Hawk's face. "Trust me, you'll know it when you hear it." He turned to head up the tunnel, then paused. "Oh, and Mary, your father would be proud of you tonight." Before she could respond, Hawk had melted into the darkness ahead, moving with the same fluid grace he'd shown in the saloon. But now there was something more predatory in his movement. The ghost marshal was going hunting in the dark heart of the mountain, while above them, Cole's madness threatened to bury Devil's Gulch in a tomb of rock and snow. The night was far from over, and its darkest moments still lay ahead in the shadowy tunnels that honeycombed the mountainside. The darkness in the mountain's heart was absolute, broken only by the distant flicker of lantern light where Cole's men were setting their charges. Hawk moved like a shadow through the tunnels, his boots making no sound on the rough stone floor. Years of experience had taught him how to use darkness as an ally, how to let his other senses compensate for what his eyes couldn't see. Above, another explosion shook the mountain, sending a shower of loose rock clattering through the tunnels. The sound of support timbers groaning under stress echoed through the darkness, a haunting reminder of how precarious their situation had become. But it was the voices ahead that drew Hawk's attention. Harsh whispers and the occasional curse as Cole's men worked to plant their explosives. "Hurry it up!" A voice Hawk recognized as Bear's growled. "Boss wants these charges set before that marshal figures out what we're really doing." The big man's voice carried a note of nervousness that hadn't been there in the saloon. "This hole, and things insane," another voice responded. "We're going to bring the whole mountain down on our heads." "Better that than letting the Brotherhood fall," Bear snapped. "You heard the boss. If we can't have Devil's Gulch, no one will. Now get those charges placed proper. These support beams are the key to the whole thing." Hawk pressed himself against the rough tunnel wall, using the darkness to his advantage as he inched closer. The lantern light revealed 3 men working at a crucial junction where multiple support beams came together. Bear stood watch while the others carefully positioned their explosives. None of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the wall behind them. "You know what your boss never understood about the Brotherhood?" Hawk's quiet voice seemed to come from everywhere at once in the confined space. The men spun around, but the lantern light only created more shadows, making it impossible to pinpoint his location. He thought fear was stronger than hope. Bear fired blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flash momentarily lighting up the tunnel like lightning. But Hawk had already moved, and the bullet only struck stone. The echo of the shot was deafening in the confined space, drowning out the sound of Hawk's movement until it was too late. The first man went down with a quiet grunt, swept off his feet by a leg sweep he never saw coming. The second caught a glimpse of movement and managed to get off a shot, but Hawk was already inside his guard. The gun went flying into the darkness. As Hawk's elbow found the man's temple with surgical precision, Bear, showing more wisdom than he had in the saloon, dropped his gun and raised his hands. "How?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "How did you do all this? Turn our own men against us? Set this whole thing up?" "Because Cole made the same mistake you just did," Hawk replied, stepping into the lantern light. He thought this was about him, about the Brotherhood. But it was always about the people of Devil's Gulch, people like Mary Sullivan and Old Tom, people who just needed someone to show them they didn't have to be afraid anymore. A rumble from above sent more debris raining down, reminding them of the precarious situation. Hawk quickly examined the charges the men had placed, his expression growing grimmer. "How many more teams are setting charges?" "4," Bear answered quickly, perhaps hoping cooperation might earn him leniency. "2 in the upper galleries, 2 in the main shaft. But Cole," he hesitated. "Cole's got something else planned. Something about the old powder magazine from the mining company days." Hawk's eyes narrowed. "The original blasting powder storage, that was supposed to be empty." "Brotherhood's been stockpiling there for months," Bear said. "There's enough powder in there too He didn't need to finish. If Cole detonated that much blasting powder in the heart of the mountain, it wouldn't just bring down the mine. It would trigger a collapse that could bury half the town. Another explosion rocked the tunnel, closer this time. Hawk quickly secured Bear and his unconscious companions, using their own gun belts to bind them. "Where's the old powder magazine?" "Northern. And tunnel complex. 3rd level down," Bear replied. "But you'll never make it in time. Cole's probably already—" His words were cut off by a sound that made their blood run cold, the deep, resonant crack of ancient stone finally giving way under. Too much stress. The mountain itself seemed to shudder, and in the distance they could hear men shouting in panic. "It's starting," Bear whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "The preliminary charges. They're destabilizing the whole system." Hawk was already moving, pausing only long enough to grab one of the lanterns. "If anyone comes for you, tell them Marshal Hawk said to get out of the mountain. Everyone, now!" He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Bear staring after him. The big man had seen many brave men in his life and many fools, but he had never seen anyone run towards certain death with such calm determination. The northern tunnel complex was a maze of intersecting passages, many of them partially collapsed from years of neglect. Hawk moved as fast as he dared, counting junctions and listening for any sound that might guide him. The explosions had stopped, but that was almost worse. Now he could hear the mountain itself groaning, tortured stone preparing to give way. Ahead, a faint glow indicated another lantern. Hawk doused his own, letting his eyes adjust as he crept forward. Cole's voice drifted through the darkness, punctuated by the sound of powder kegs being positioned. "Perfect, isn't it?" the gang leader was saying to someone. "They thought they could take my town, destroy everything I built, but they never understood. Devil's Gulch was built on blood and pain, and that's how it'll end." "You're insane," another voice responded. "Thomas Green, the mining clerk. You'll kill everyone, including yourself." "Some prices are worth paying," Cole replied, "to teach them that there are consequences for defying the Brotherhood, to show everyone in the territory what happens when they think they can stand against us." Hawk edged closer, using the shadows of mining equipment as cover. In the lantern light, he could see Cole and 2 of his men arranging powder kegs around. A central support column. Green was tied to another column, watching helplessly. The chamber was larger than Hawk had expected, and the amount of powder stored there was staggering. The mountain shuddered again, and this time the sound of collapsing tunnel came from somewhere above them. Cole smiled at the sound, a terrible joy in his expression as he prepared to strike the match that would end Devil's Gulch forever. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, William." Hawk's voice carried clearly through the chamber, though he remained hidden in the shadows. Cole's men spun around, guns drawn, but their leader remained focused on the powder kegs, match in hand. "Come to watch the show, Marshal." Cole's voice held a note of madness now, the facade of the calculating crime boss completely stripped away. "It's fitting, really. The great ghost marshal, buried forever in the heart of a mountain. They'll tell stories about this night for years to come." "They already are," Hawk replied, his voice seeming to come from a different direction now. "But not the story you think. Right now, all across Devil's Gulch, people are standing up. Fighting back, your men are surrendering or running. The Brotherhood is falling apart, William. All that's left is for you to decide how it ends." Cole's laugh echoed off the stone walls. "Oh, I've decided how it ends, Marshal. I decided the moment. You walked into my saloon with your clever plans and your turned men." He gestured to Green with his free hand. "Ask our friend here. He understands what happens when you try to change things, when you think you can simply wash away years of blood and pain with your justice." Green struggled against his bonds, his face streaked with dust and blood. "Your own men are dying up there, Cole. The preliminary charges have destabilized the entire northern face. Even if you don't light that powder, we've only got minutes before—" Before the mountain comes down, anyway, Cole finished, his smile growing wider. The difference is, with this much powder, it won't just be the mine that goes. The collapse will take half the town with it. Every house, every shop, every person who thought they could defy me, buried in a tomb of their own making. Another. Rumble shook the chamber stronger than before. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling as support timbers creaked ominously. Cole's two remaining men exchanged nervous glances, their guns wavering as they searched the shadows for any sign of Hawk. You know what's truly ironic? Cole continued, carefully arranging the last powder keg. You did this. You and your careful plans, turning my men against me, thinking you could dismantle everything I built piece by piece. But all you did was force my hand. Make me show everyone what real power looks like. Real power? Now Hawk's voice came from somewhere near the chamber's entrance. Real power isn't about fear, William. It's not about how many men you can threaten or how much damage you can do. Real power is what I saw tonight in Mary Sullivan's eyes when she finally stood up to you, in old Tom's hands when he picked up that shotgun, in every person in this town who decided they'd rather die fighting than live under your boot. Pretty words, Marshal. Cole struck the match, its small flame casting twisted shadows on the chamber walls. But words don't change anything. Actions do. Let's see how brave they all feel when their precious town comes crashing down around their ears. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Cole moved to drop the match onto the nearest powder keg, but a shot rang out, impossibly precise in the chaos. The match flew from his fingers, extinguished in mid-air. Before anyone could react, two more shots followed in quick succession, disarming. Cole's men with surgical accuracy. Hawk stepped into the lantern light, his gun still smoking. It's over, William. Has been since the moment you decided to make this personal. But Cole wasn't finished. With shocking speed, he drew a hidden derringer from his sleeve, aiming not at Hawk, but at the nearest powder keg. You can't watch everything, Marshal. Can't save everyone. That's what you never understood. Sometimes the darkness wins. You're right, Hawk admitted quietly. I can't save everyone, but tonight I don't have to. He nodded toward the chamber entrance, where more figures were emerging from the shadows. Billy, Mary Sullivan, and several other townspeople, all with weapons trained on Cole and his men. We heard everything, Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. About the powder, about your plans for the town. The whole mountain's coming down, Cole. But you won't be taking Devil's Gulch with it. Cole's eyes darted between the newcomers, his derringer wavering. Above them, the mountain groaned again, and this time the sound of collapsing tunnel was much closer. Dust filled the air as more debris rained down from the ceiling. It's your choice, Hawk said, his gun never wavering from Cole's chest. But whatever you decide, decide fast. This whole chamber's about to collapse. For a moment, something like reason seemed to flicker in Cole's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a terrible resolve. If I can't have it, he snarled. No one... His words were cut off by the deafening crack of stone giving way. A massive support beam splintered above them, sending a cascade of rock and timber crashing down. Hawk dove forward, tackling Cole away from the powder kegs as the ceiling began to cave in. Everyone out, he shouted, wrestling with Cole in the growing chaos. Billy, get them to the surface now. Mary and the others hesitated only a moment before helping Green free of his bonds and heading for the exit. Cole's men, seeing their leader locked in combat with Hawk, chose survival over loyalty and fled into the tunnels. In the failing lantern light, Hawk and Cole grappled on the chamber floor, each trying to gain control of the derringer. Around, in them, the mountain's death throes grew louder, punctuated by the sharp cracks of support beams giving way. You'll die too, Cole gasped as they fought. The great ghost marshal buried alive in the dark. Maybe, Hawk replied, finally wrenching the derringer away and landing a solid blow to Cole's jaw. "But Devil's Gulch will survive, and that's worth any price." The last support beam groaned overhead, and both men looked up to see the chamber's ceiling beginning to collapse in earnest. The final battle for Devil's Gulch would be decided here, in the darkness beneath the mountain, as time ran out for both hunter and prey. The mountain's rage reached a deafening crescendo as Hawk dragged Cole toward the chamber entrance. Rock and timber crashed down around them, the last supports giving way as decades of mining tunnels finally surrendered to gravity's inexorable pull. The lantern had shattered in the chaos, leaving them in near total darkness, broken only by occasional sparks from rock striking rock. "Let go of me." Cole struggled like a wild animal, seemingly unconcerned with the destruction raining down around them. "If I'm going to die, I'm taking you with me." He managed to land an elbow to Hawk's wounded arm, breaking free and stumbling back toward the powder kegs. "William!" Hawk's voice cut through the chaos. "There's still time! The secondary tunnel! His!" Words were cut off by the sound of Cole's maniacal laughter. In the darkness, they could hear him fumbling with something. The scratch of another match being struck illuminated his face in an eerie glow, his eyes wide with a terrible joy. "You know what my father taught me, Marshal?" Cole's voice carried clearly despite the mountain's death throes. He said a real, "Man makes his own fate, doesn't let others decide his ending." The match flame wavered as debris continued to fall. "This is my ending, my choice." Hawk's gun seemed to materialize in his hand. "Drop it, William. Even you can't be this far gone." "Can't I?" Cole's smile was terrible to behold in the match's glow. "You took everything from me. My brotherhood, my town, my legacy, but this—" He moved the match closer to the nearest powder keg. "This they'll remember forever." What happened next seemed to unfold between heartbeats. Cole moved to drop the match just as a massive boulder crashed down from above. Hawk's shot rang out simultaneously, striking Cole's hand. The match flew wide, its flame extinguished by the very air displacement of the falling rock. Cole screamed in pain and rage, but the sound was swallowed by the mountain's collapse. "Move!" Hawk grabbed Cole's collar, bodily dragging him toward the secondary tunnel entrance. The gang leader fought him every step of the way, even as the chamber behind them disappeared under tons of rock and timber. They half ran, half stumbled through the narrow escape tunnel, the collapse following close behind, like some great beast snapping at their heels. The air grew thick with rock dust, making every breath a struggle. Cole continued to resist, forcing Hawk to practically carry him through the darkness. "Why?" Cole gasped between coughs. "Why save me? After everything—" "Because that's the difference between us," Hawk replied, his voice strained with effort. "You see people as tools or obstacles. I see them as worth saving, even you." The tunnel ahead showed a faint glimmer of light, torches from the rescue party that had followed Mary and the others out. But the distance seemed impossible as the collapse gained on them, the very ground beneath their feet beginning to buckle. "Almost there," Hawk muttered, more to himself than Cole. Just a few more. The last support beam between them and safety gave way with a sound like thunder. Hawk shoved Cole forward with all his remaining strength, sending the gang leader tumbling toward the light. The action cost him precious seconds as the tunnel roof came down. "Marshal!" Billy's voice carried from ahead, where torchlight revealed several figures rushing back toward them. "This way!" Hawk dove forward as the mountain seemed to fold in on itself. Something struck his back, then his leg, but he kept moving, crawling, fighting for every inch. Hands grabbed him. Billy, Mary, others he couldn't see through the dust, pulling him the last few feet to safety. They collapsed in the main gallery, just as the secondary tunnel sealed itself forever, entombing the powder magazine and all its deadly potential beneath tons of rock. For several long moments, no one moved. The sound of their ragged breathing, barely audible over the continued rumbling of settling stone. Is it over?" Mary's voice shook as she helped Hawk to his feet. His leg screamed in protest, definitely damaged, but not broken. "The collapse!" Green was studying the walls with a mining engineer's eye. "It's sealed off the entire northern complex. The town should be safe now that the pressure's been released." He turned to Hawk. "But how did you know the secondary and tunnel would hold?" "Didn't," Hawk admitted, wincing as he tested his injured leg. "Just knew we had to try." A bitter laugh drew their attention to Cole, who sat propped against the gallery wall, cradling his shot hand. "Still playing the hero, Marshal? Still pretending there's justice in this world?" His voice dripped contempt. "Look around you. Look. What your justice has brought. A broken mountain, a ruined town. Was it worth it?" Hawk studied Cole for a long moment, seeing not the feared leader of the Wolf Pack Brotherhood, but a broken man unable to understand why his power had slipped away. "Ask them," he said quietly, nodding toward Mary and the others. "Ask them if freedom from fear is worth any price." The sound of running feet echoed through the gallery as more townspeople arrived, led by Old Tom and Sarah. The news they brought made even Cole fall silent. The wolf pack was finished. Those who hadn't surrendered had fled into the night. The town was free. "The Marshal's men just rode in from Fort Benton," Old Tom reported, his weathered face split by a fierce grin. "They're rounding up the last of the Brotherhood. It's really over." But Hawk's expression remained troubled as he looked back toward the collapsed tunnel. "Not quite," he said softly. "The hardest part's still ahead." "What do you mean?" Mary asked. "Rebuilding, healing, learning to trust again." He turned to face the gathered townspeople. "The Brotherhood's gone, but the real work is just beginning. Devil's Gulch has to decide what kind of town it wants to be now." The truth of his words settled over the group as the last echoes of the mountain's fury faded into silence. They had won their freedom, but at a cost that would take years to fully understand. The physical wounds would heal, but the scars, both on the mountain and in the town's collective memory, would remain. As if reading their thoughts, Hawk added, "But you won't have to do it alone." Dawn broke over Devil's Gulch, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of gold and rose. The mountain's fury had finally subsided, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of workers clearing debris and townspeople emerging to survey the damage. The northern face bore a massive scar where the collapse had changed its profile forever. But the town itself had been spared the worst of Cole's intended destruction. In the Iron Horse Saloon, now serving as a makeshift headquarters for the cleanup effort, Hawk sat at his usual spot at the bar while Doc Wilson wrapped his injured leg. Mary Sullivan moved between groups of townspeople, organizing relief efforts with quiet efficiency. The change in her was remarkable. Gone was the fear that had shadowed her eyes for so long, replaced by a steady determination. "You know," Old Tom said as he placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Hawk, "folks are already talking about rebuilding, not just the damaged buildings, but everything, making Devil's Gulch what it was meant to be before the Brotherhood came." "Good coffee," Hawk remarked, taking a sip. "Seems like just yesterday I was saying that." Was that really only last night? Mary joined them at the bar, exhaustion evident in her face, but unable to dim the light of hope in her eyes. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Through the saloon's windows, they could see Marshal Jenkins from Fort Benton supervising as the last of the Wolfpack members were loaded into prison wagons. Cole sat apart from his former men, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched his empire crumble. The feared leader of the Brotherhood had been reduced to just another prisoner, his legendary power evaporating like morning frost in the sun. "The territorial judge will be here next week," Jenkins had told them earlier. "Between the documentation, your mining clerk saved, and the testimonies we've gathered, the Brotherhood won't be troubling anyone for a very long time." Now, as the morning wore on, more townspeople filtered into the saloon, drawn by some unspoken need to be together, to share in the triumph and tragedy of what had happened. Sarah Wheeler moved among them, helping tend to minor injuries and offering comfort where needed. The bruise on her cheek was already fading, but the strength that had allowed her to strike back against Cole seemed to have taken permanent root. "Tell me something, Marshal," Thomas Green said, pulling up a chair next to Hawk. "How long had you really been planning this? The way everything came together? The turned men, the strategic charges, the escape tunnels?" Hawk set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "Sometimes the best plans are the ones that grow naturally. Every person who decided they'd had enough, every small act of resistance, it was all there, waiting for a spark." He gestured around the saloon. "I just helped light the fuse." "And the Ghost Marshal legend?" Billy asked, joining them. The young man's face still showed signs of the fight, but he carried himself with new confidence. "Was any of that real?" "Legends," Hawk replied with a slight smile, "have a way of growing beyond the truth. But sometimes they serve a purpose. Fear of a ghost can make brave men out of those who thought themselves cowards." "Speaking of ghosts," Mary said, her voice taking on a hesitant note, Will you be staying? At least until we get the town back on its feet?" The question seemed to hang in the air as conversations around them quieted. Everyone knew the stories, how the Ghost Marshal never stayed in one place long, moving on once justice had been served. But something felt different this time, as if Devil's Gulch had worked its way under Hawk's skin in a way few places had before. "Got a telegram from the territorial governor this morning," Hawk said after a long moment. "Seems Devil's Gulch is in need of a new town marshal, someone who knows the territory, understands the people." He took another sip of coffee. "Thought I might consider it if the town's agreeable." The hope that blazed in Mary's eyes was matched by the smiles breaking out across the saloon. Old Tom actually laughed out loud, a sound few had heard since the Brotherhood's reign began. "But first," Hawk continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there's something that needs doing." He stood carefully, testing his injured leg. "Mr. Green, would you gather everyone in the street? There's a tradition that needs observing." Half an hour later, practically the entire population of Devil's Gulch had assembled in the main street. The prison wagons had departed, taking Cole and his men to face territorial justice, but their shadow still lingered over the town. Hawk stood on the saloon's porch, his quiet voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "In my time wearing a badge," he began, "I've learned that justice isn't just about catching criminals or enforcing laws. It's about healing, about helping good people find their strength again." He produced a handful of Wolf Pack badges, the silver wolf's headpins that had terrorized the territory for so long. "These symbols of fear have no place in the new Devil's Gulch." One by one, people stepped forward to add their own gathered badges to the pile. Each pin represented a personal story of suffering, of loss, of fear, but also of survival. When the last badge had been added, Hawk produced a hammer. The sound of silver being crushed into unrecognizable fragments rang out like a bell, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. As the gathered crowd watched, the destroyed symbols of their former oppression were gathered up to be melted down. "The silver will be recast," Hawk announced. "Used to make a new sign for the town hall. A reminder that everything can be remade, if people have the courage to try." As the crowd began to disperse, Mary Sullivan stepped closer to Hawk. "You know," she said softly, "some people are saying this will make an even better story than the Ghost Marshal legend." Hawk watched as the townspeople returned to their work, seeing not victims or survivors, but builders of something new. "Maybe," he replied, "but the best part of this story isn't about me. It's about them, about how an entire town found its courage and stood up against the darkness. The morning sun climbed higher, casting the shadow of the scarred mountain across Devil's Gulch. But now that shadow seemed less threatening, more like the embrace of an old friend who had weathered the storm alongside them. The town had changed, and so had its people. The ghost of fear that had haunted these streets had finally been laid to rest, replaced by something stronger, hope, stronger. And as Nathan Hawke looked out over the town that had asked him to stay, he realized that sometimes the most powerful legends aren't about mysterious lawmen or fearsome outlaws. Sometimes they're about ordinary people who decide that enough is enough and find within themselves the strength to change their world. 1 month later, Devil's Gulch had begun to transform. The scars remained, both on the mountain's face and in the hearts of its people, but like all honest scars, they told a story of survival. The newly cast town sign gleamed in the afternoon sun, its silver surface a testament to redemption and renewal, forged from the very badges that had once inspired terror. Marshal Nathan Hawke stood on the saloon's porch, watching as a supply wagon made its way up the steep street. The Iron Horse itself had been rebuilt, Mary Sullivan overseeing every detail just as her father would have wanted. Old Tom still tended bar, his granddaughter Sarah now helping manage the books, her quiet strength and inspiration to others still finding their way back from darkness. "Hard to believe it's been a month," Mary said, joining him on the porch. "Sometimes. I still expect to wake up and find it was all a dream." "The best kind of change," Hawke replied, "is the kind that feels like waking up from a long nightmare." He adjusted the new marshal's badge on his coat, not silver like the old Wolf Pack symbols, but simple brass that caught the sunlight like hope made solid. Inside the saloon, they could hear the sounds of the town council meeting wrapping up. Thomas Green had been elected mayor, his experience with both the mine's operations and the Brotherhood's methods making him uniquely qualified to help rebuild. Billy served as his deputy, the young man's dedication to making amends earning him the town's trust. "Got word from Fort Benton this morning," Hawke said quietly. "Cole and the Brotherhood leadership have been sentenced. 20 years hard labor. The judge was particularly interested in those records you and Green saved." Mary nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And the others, the ones who surrendered?" "Reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Some will be out in a few years." He turned to gauge her reaction. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, a month ago, I would have wanted them all hanged." She was silent for a moment, watching. Children play in the street, something that hadn't happened during the Brotherhood's reign. But now, maybe some of them deserve a chance to change, like the town did. Up at the mine, work had resumed under new management, a cooperative of local families who had survived the Brotherhood's rule. The collapsed northern tunnels remained, sealed, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But new shafts were being dug, following rich veins that promised prosperity built on honest labor rather than fear. The grandfather clock inside the saloon struck 4, its familiar chimes carrying clearly in the mountain air. It had survived. That terrible night somehow, just like the spirit of the town itself. Now it kept time for a new era in Devil's Gulch's history. "You know what I think?" Old Tom said, bringing fresh coffee to where they stood. "I think some stories are too important to just be legends. They need to be remembered proper, so folks don't forget what can happen when good people stand together." Hawke accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "The best stories," he said, "are the ones that keep giving people hope. Remind them that darkness doesn't last forever." As the sun began its descent behind the mountain, casting long shadows across Devil's Gulch's renewed streets, the town settled into its evening routine. But unlike before, there was no fear in the gathering darkness, no rushing to bolt doors or draw shutters. Instead, lanterns were lit one by one, pushing back the night with warm, steady light. And if sometimes, in the depths of those nights, people spoke in hushed tones about the ghost marshal who had helped them find their courage, well, that was just another legend adding its thread to the rich tapestry of frontier justice. But the real story, the one that would be passed down through generations, wasn't about a mysterious lawman at all. It was about a town that had faced its demons and emerged stronger, about ordinary people who discovered that the power to change, their world had been within them all along, about courage and hope and the kind of justice that comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the hearts of those who decide to stand together against the darkness. What happened in Devil's Gulch that snowy night, when the mountains shook, would be told and retold, growing perhaps in the telling as all good stories do. But at its heart, it remained a testament to the simple truth that Nathan Hawke had known all along, that sometimes the most powerful force for justice isn't a legendary lawman or a lightning-fast gun, but the moment when ordinary people finally say, "Enough," and find their own strength. And so ends our tale of Devil's Gulch and the Ghost Marshal. But somewhere out on the frontier, other towns still wait in darkness, other people still need to find their courage. And perhaps, if you listen carefully on a quiet night, you might hear the distant sound of spurs jingling softly as justice rides on to where it's needed next. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because tomorrow we have another incredible tale of frontier justice that you won't want to miss.